on the morning of July 1st, 1863, Major General Henry Heath for the Confederates would leave Cashtown and he would make his way to Gettysburg. Awaiting Major General Henry Heath was about 3,000 cavalry troopers under the command of General John Buford. Now, we are at the Whistler House, and this is one of the many vidette posts that Buford would set up in and around the town of Gettysburg. And just up ahead here is the marker that claims the very first shot of Gettysburg would be fired from. So we're going to check out the marker here, and after that we're going to head back towards the town of Gettysburg, and then we're going to see how this battle evolves into one of the bloodiest battles in American history. So this right here is the Whistler House, and this was one of many vidette posts or observation posts that General Buford would set up in and around the town of Gettysburg. And the Confederates would be advancing from this direction. If you take this road, this is the Chambersburg Road, and if you take this road, you'll go into Cashtown, and that's where they were based. But from this exact vidette post, this marker here claims that the very first shot to kick off the Battle of Gettysburg was fired from right here. We're going to try that again when a big logging truck doesn't go by, but this marker claims the very first shot of Gettysburg was fired from. So I made my way to the back of the Whistler House here, and these vidette posts would have anywhere between 3 to 5 cavalry troopers, and manning this post were Privates Thomas B. Kelly, George Sager, James Hale, and H.O. Dodge. Now, early in the morning of July 1st, Schaefer was able to make out dust clouds on the distance along what was called the Chambersburg Pike then. Now it's called the Chambersburg Road. And when he would see those dust clouds from advancing Confederate infantry, he would call for his boss, Lieutenant Jones. Now, Marsh Creek is approximately 700 yards away, which would be this direction. And that's where this vidette post here would spot the dust clouds from the advancing Confederate infantry. Now, Private Sager would raise his carbine to fire on the advancing Confederates. Now, keep in mind that the average distance for a Sharps carbine was about 200 to 300 yards. That's the effective range on those weapons. So the Confederates were about 700 yards away. Now, these were breech loading weapons, which means they would load them from the back of the gun. They were single shot, but they still had a higher rate of fire than your standard muzzle loading infantry muskets. So just before Private Sager would fire the first shot, Lieutenant Jones would stop him and say, "Hold on, George. Give me the honor of firing the opening ball." Jones dismounted and asked Sergeant Schaefer for his carbine. He rested it on a fence rail nearby and fired at an officer on a gray horse. Obviously, a target this far away, he had no shot of hitting his target, but the element of surprise for the Confederacy was over, and the first shot of Gettysburg was fired right here. Making our way to the marker here. Now, there's no way of knowing that if this was the very first shot that would have been fired to kick off the Battle of Gettysburg. They were skirmishing in and around the town in the days prior, but a man by the name of Corporal Ophelius Hodges of the 9th New York of Company F declared that he fired the first shot. But I guess Lieutenant Jones here had enough backing to place this marker here. Now, whether or not he fired the true first shot here, we'll never know. But it's worth stating that this shot here would be one of nearly 7 million rounds fired here at Gettysburg over the 3 days. It's probably hard to read, but it says, "Fired by Captain Jones with Sergeant Schaefer's carbine, 8th Illinois Cavalry." Wow. This monument was placed here in 1886. And making our way on this side. The first shot, July 1st, 1863, at approximately 7:30 a.m. Now, although the Confederates had the superior numbers, Buford's cavalrymen, like we touched on a little bit ago, were carrying Sharps carbines. These rifles were shorter. They had a higher rate of fire, about almost triple that of a standard infantry musket. Now, this gave them a big advantage. Not only were they on the defensive, they were able to fire from behind buildings, fire from behind fence posts and rails and things like that, stone walls. If you're carrying your standard infantry musket, it's about, 4.5, 5 feet long, so you can't really reload it from a crouching or sitting position. You have to be standing while reloading that, which makes you an easier target. On top of, Buford's men had a higher rate of fire, so they can portray that they were a larger force. And when you're on the defensive, you can easily delay a larger force with superior firepower. It took the Confederates up until almost 10 o'clock just to reach the area around McPherson's Ridge, which is where we're going to head next. We're going to see how this battle evolves, and Hopefully we're going to see how the terrain really helped the Union slow down the Confederate advance. We've made our way back towards the town of Gettysburg, and I want to reorient you here before we begin. So in the distance here you have Seminary Ridge and you have General Buford's cupola in this area, and here you have McPherson's Ridge where the Iron Brigade would come to battle line and advance into the Herbst Woods there. And we started in this direction. Now that first shot marker we just saw is about 1.5 miles to 2 miles west, headed towards Cashtown. Now that first shot was fired at 7:30. And this delaying action would obviously delay the Confederates like it was intended to. They didn't reach this area till almost 10:30. And right around that time, General Reynolds was arriving with Union infantry. He had 2 brigades, and one of the brigades was the Iron Brigade under the command of Solomon Meredith. They would be coming to a line of battle in that field just before us here. But before that brigade was engaged, there was already a Union brigade to the right or north of the railroad cut. And that brigade was under the command of Lysander Cutler. And he positioned 3 regiments north of the railroad cut, or the Union right. And he would have 2 regiments positioned south of the railroad cut, or to the left. Again, you have the Herbst Woods there, where the Iron Brigade would be fighting. And then you had 2 regiments from Lysander Cutler's brigade. You had the 95th New York and the 84th New York, and the 84th was also known as the 14th Brooklyn. And on the Union right, you had the 147th New York, the 56th Pennsylvania, and the 76th New York. Now these regiments would make up the extreme Union right flank at this point of the battle here. Now you also had Confederate troops forming on both sides of the railroad cut. You had Joe Davis's brigade that would be coming to line of battle straight ahead, and you also had James Archer's brigade getting ready to clash with the Iron Brigade in the Herbst Woods. But like I said, before the Iron Brigade was engaged, the Union troops on the right were already engaging with Joe Davis's brigade here on the Union right. Now if that name sounds familiar, I believe Joe Davis was the nephew of the Confederate President Jefferson Davis. Now the Union troops here on the right would be facing regiments from Mississippi and North Carolina. You had the 2nd and the 42nd Mississippi, along with the 55th North Carolina. And these troops far outnumbered Lysander Cutler's troops here on the right. And in fact, their line kind of overlapped the Union troops here. So shortly before deploying these troops, a colonel from the 56th Pennsylvania would look at Lysander Cutler and ask if those are the enemy. Lysander Cutler would reply yes, and the 56th Pennsylvania would deliver the first volley from Union infantry here at Gettysburg. Now, the 56th Pennsylvania and the 76th New York would pull back once Lysander Cutler realized this position was untenable due to the Confederates essentially overlapping the Union right flank here. Well, unfortunately for the 147th New York, they wouldn't get this order. Their commander, Lieutenant Colonel Francis Miller, was shot and killed before this order could reach him and his men. So the 147th New York would make a stand here against overwhelming Confederate forces. You had the 42nd Mississippi attacking their front. You had the 2nd Mississippi and the 52nd North Carolina, I believe, attacking their flank now. So they would refuse their line and make somewhat of an L formation, and this regiment would just be chewed up here. And in fact, of the 380 officers and men that were brought into battle here, they would lose 207 here at the fighting just north of the railroad cut. Now finally, an order did reach the 147th, and they were able to pull back to the wood line here along with the 52nd Pennsylvania and the 75th New York. And just to give you an example of how long a regiment would have been in line of battle, here is the right flank of the 147th New York, and the left flank is that marker just below the bridge there to the left of that white SUV. And I worked my way down a little more. So you have the left flank marker. That's the left flank of the 56th Pennsylvania butting up against the right flank of the 147th New York. And here's the line where the 56th Pennsylvania would have been. And this is where the first Union infantry volley would have been shot from, directed at Joe Davis's brigade across this field here as they were advancing on the Union positions. So I'm back over towards the railroad cut now, and just to kind of give you a layout of the land here, straight ahead, that is the Herbst Woods, and around 10:45, between 10:30 and 10:45, the Iron Brigade would be engaged in those woods there, and the 6th Wisconsin, they would be placed in reserve. Now, seeing the Union right flank faltering and retreating, Abner Doubleday, who was now in command because General Reynolds would be killed here in the opening minutes of the battle, he would send the 6th Wisconsin to this area to attempt to slow down Joe Davis's brigade here advancing towards the railroad cut. And accompanying the 6th Wisconsin was the 84th and 95th New York. Now the 84th, also commonly known as the 14th Brooklyn, they would see Rufus Dawes' men of the 6th Wisconsin advancing towards that fence on the other side of the Chambersburg Road there, and they would join him. And so you would have the 6th Wisconsin directly in front of us, and then you would have the 95th New York, and then on their flank would be the 14th Brooklyn, or the 84th New York. Now, just to kind of show you the field of fire here, so that fence line there, that's where the Union troops would initially stop and begin delivering volleys towards the Confederate forces. They would be hit with those volleys, and all of a sudden they would disappear into that railroad cut before us here. Now, once those Confederates would disappear into the railroad cut, Rufus Dawes would look over at the commander of the 95th New York. They'd give each other a little head nod, and they would start off charging across this field before us here. The 6th Wisconsin's colors would fall 3 times under this withering Confederate fire here. And at one point, Rufus Dawes would pick up the colors and advance them before they were taken by a corporal of the 6th Wisconsin. So I'm standing right next to the Chambersburg Road here, or the Chambersburg Pike as it used to be called. And the 6th Wisconsin was in reserve back in this area. And there is the Herbst Woods. Now the rest of the Iron Brigade was engaged in the Herbst Woods, and I'm going to pan back to my right here over towards the railroad cut. The Union regiments under the command of Lysander Cutler were essentially routed on the Union right. Bull Davis's brigade, seeing this opportunity, began to turn their attention to the Iron Brigade that was fighting in the Herbst Woods here. So right now we are walking in the footsteps of the 6th Wisconsin, and we're assaulting the railroad cut here. And these trees behind me, that's the railroad cut. That's where the Confederates are firing from. So we're advancing across this open field, and we're under withering Confederate fire. Now, they weren't able to fire from every place on the cut. The closer we got, actually, the harder it was for them to fire, just because how steep the railroad cut actually was. But I mean, how awesome is this? This is the beautiful thing about history. Walking in the footsteps of people you read about, documentaries you watch, and just be able to come out here, see what they saw, and get a little glimpse into what they experienced, and there's nothing better. But this field behind me would have been riddled with Union infantrymen as they were assaulting the railroad cut here. So we've seen this attack from the Union perspective, and we've hopped back over to the Confederate side, and we're going to see this attack from their perspective. Now, the Union, they would start in this general area, and they would advance across this open field here. Right now we're on a bridge overlooking the railroad cut. And before we hop into the railroad cut, I want to show you something about the terrain here. You can see there's different elevations within the cut. So right here is a pretty steep slope. You're not going to be able to fire out of that. But if you go down a little more, it's a little more tenable to be able to fire out of. So, you know, you would think that this position would have been a really strong defensive position, but it actually impeded the Confederates quite a bit. Now, something to also note, this railroad track was not here. This was an unfinished railroad cut. But you would have Davis's brigade, or elements of Davis's brigade, turn right and threaten the right flank of the Iron Brigade as they're engaged in Herbst Woods. And their men would begin to advance on this position, and that's when the counterattack was started by Rufus Dawes and the 6th Wisconsin, the 14th Brooklyn, or 84th New York, and the 95th New York. So let's hop into the railroad cut and just see the Confederates' perspective here. Making our way down here. And to show you where we started, we were just on top of that bridge there. And we're making our way down to the railroad cut. So this is the field where Joe Davis's brigades would have been advancing towards the Iron Brigade, and Rufus Dawes would observe the Confederate soldiers advancing towards him, and then all of a sudden disappear. And, well, they were hopping in this unfinished cut. Making our way into the cut. Don't fall, don't fall, don't fall. Here it is. Wow. So again, you can kind of see just before us, that would probably have been a good position to fire from. But right here, directly in front of us, that's pretty steep. That's at least 10 to 12 feet. You are not firing from this position here. And we're in the cut now. Can't believe I'm finally here. I've read about this battle, can't tell you how many times, and to actually walk in the railroad cut is just an incredible experience. Now we're making our way to observe what the Confederates saw, if they were able to. So this is the field where the Union troops would have been advancing across of, charging this position here. Now there's a period where the Union troops are so close, they can stand pretty much on this embankment here and fire down into the cut. And as you can see, this embankment on the other side is steep enough where you couldn't get out of it easy enough, especially if you're aware it was 10 to 12 feet high like we saw near the bridge. But you're essentially, not to downplay the carnage that was here, but you're essentially shooting fish in a barrel here. And once the Union made this crest here, the Confederates began to surrender, and a brutal fight for the Confederate colors was beginning to take place. Now, as the Union troops got closer to the railroad cut, their formation, instead of a nice straight line or linear formation as they were charging, their formation took on the shape of a V, and they were about to pierce the Confederate lines here. Now, when the Union men reached the railroad cut, vicious hand-to-hand and bayonet fighting broke out within the cut, and they were also able to pour fire down into the cut and trapping the Confederates essentially. Now, many Confederates would instantly surrender, and Colonel Dawes would stand at the crest of the cut here, and he would shout down, "Where is the colonel of this regiment?" Major John Blair of the 2nd Mississippi would sit up, and he would ask, "Who are you?" Dawes replied, "I am in command of this regiment. Surrender, or I will fire." Now, Dawes would later write, "The officer replied not a word, but promptly handed me his sword, and his men, who still held him, threw down their muskets. The coolness, self-possession, and discipline which held back our men from pouring a general volley saved hundreds of lives of the enemy, and in my mind goes back to the fearful excitement of the moment I marveled in." And that was an account from Rufus Dawes in 1890. And here's some of the flank markers here. You have the right flank of the 95th New York, and then you have the left flank of the 6th Wisconsin, who was part of the Iron Brigade. And again, they would make this crest here, and you can see, you can just look right into the railroad cut here, and this position that offered cover was now a position that essentially trapped you. And looking down the cut, looking south, or I guess this would be east, towards the town of Gettysburg. And just giving you some stats of the battle here, the Union regiments lost around 400 men of the 1,100 that were engaged here. But they successfully blunted Joe Davis's attack here, and essentially saved the Iron Brigade, who is currently fighting in the Herbst Woods to my right. And that would cause the Union to kind of re-secure the right flank here, headed towards Oak Ridge. And I believe close to 500 Confederates would be killed and wounded in this railroad cut and around this area, and also another 200 would be taken prisoner. So this is a pretty big loss for the Confederates. And when you think of the railroad cut, you would think of a really strong defensive position, but once the Union troops got up close and personal, it kind of essentially worked against them and trapped them. Well, that was the first episode of my Gettysburg series. We saw where the first shot was fired from, supposedly, and we also explored a lot of the action on the Union right flank, which doesn't get a whole lot of notoriety due to the Iron Brigade being engaged on the Union left in the Herbst Woods, just behind you on the camera here. So that's where we're headed next, but I'm really glad I got to highlight the fighting here, not only in and around the railroad cut, but the 1st Union Regiments actually engaged here before the Iron Brigade. That was neat to learn about. So let's head on over to the Herbst Woods and see what the Iron Brigade's up to. And we'll catch you on the next one.